Good afternoon. For today's news, we begin as the Trump administration says it will continue with plans to pull out of a landmark nuclear forces treaty with Russia. National Security Advisor John Bolton met with Russian President Vladimir Putin to discuss the treaty and a possible meeting with President Trump in Paris on the 100th anniversary of the armistice that ended World War I.
Because despite our differences, which exist because of our different national interests, it's still important to work in areas where there's a possibility of mutual cooperation.
Meanwhile, on Capitol Hill, Republicans have been pushing for an increase in the military budget. But it looks like Russiagate might be the much-needed ingredient for the Democratic Party to help make that happen. Sara Montes de Oca joins me with the details. Sara, I guess the Democrats own Russia a thank you card?
Probably, but for quite some time, we know that the Dems have led the push for Trump to take a tougher stance on Russia, and it looks like President Trump might be doing just that. In March, President Trump signed the $716 billion National Defense Authorization Act. This was a massive jump from the 2017 budget. What used to be $635 billion is now a lot higher. That's an $81 billion increase. It's clear that the bill explicitly targets Russia and China, and both sides of the political aisle used alleged Russian election interference to argue in favor of the NDAA. It looks like using Russia as a political boogeyman finds support on both sides of the aisle. Pundits and politicians have compared Russiagate to Pearl Harbor, the new Cold War, and sometimes even 9/11. The bill also tasks Secretary of Defense James Mattis with researching whether a permanently stationed United States Army Brigade combat team in Poland would enhance deterrence against Russian aggression. And President Trump had no trouble making that clear. This weekend, he said that he will walk away from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, a key treaty signed at the end of the Cold War. Both countries are accusing each other of violating that treaty, and the pact is supposed to keep the U.S. and Russia accountable. This is through a verification process that allows for on-site inspections and satellite observations. Both parties could carry out on-site inspections at each other's facilities in the U.S. and in the former Soviet Union, and includes bases in Belgium, Italy, the Netherlands, the U.K., Germany, and the Czech Republic. Trump withdrawing from the INF specifically targets not just Russia, but China as well. And China trying hard to expand its military power. The U.S. military may see the INF treaty as an obstacle to answer that new threat. And many Chinese ground-based missiles have long-ranges types of missiles that the U.S. is prohibited from developing or using under the treaty. But walking away from treaties could bring adverse diplomatic consequences. Now, we saw this with the withdrawals from the Paris Climate Accord and the Iran nuclear deal. It caused frustration and anger among America's European allies. Walking away may also make it difficult for the White House to demand denuclearization from North Korea. Scottie, if Trump follows through on what he said this weekend and walks away from the INF treaty, it's possible that this will be yet another fracture in his relationships with traditional allies in Europe and other partners around the world. And while Trump says that he is now planning to build a nuclear arsenal, it brings us back to even more military spending. And this isn't your average weapon. It's a nuclear bomb, which means a pretty hefty price tag.
Very hefty price tag. And unfortunately, at a time, Sara, has the president mentioned anything about keeping these observations? How are we supposed to see the other countries if they tear this up and they pull these observers back? Is there any sort of plan in place?
Not yet, Scottie, but hopefully soon we'll be able to see what his plan is.
Well, like most things, unfortunately, it seems like we have to wait until after it's already passed. Thank you, Sara. For more on the state of U.S.-Russia relations, we turn to former U.S. Senator from Rhode Island, Lincoln Chafee. Thanks for joining us, Senator.
Thank you for having me on the show.
So what are your thoughts on the Trump administration's decision to pull out of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty?
Well, I think it's unfortunate that American leadership is now exercising its power and ripping up agreements that were so carefully crafted and approved by the Senate by overwhelming margins. The INF was approved by 88-5, I believe, in the U.S. Senate. And we also got out of the ABM treaty under President George W. Bush. That was another Nixon treaty that was crafted with Brezhnev. Again, the Senate approved it, something like 95-3. And we never see that kind of bipartisan cooperation. But these treaties were carefully put together, and now American leadership is ripping them up. And as we just heard, that's causing consternation with our European allies and with the Chinese. And so we need to have American leadership making allies and making friendships instead of making more enemies.
Absolutely. Senator Chafee, isn't it sort of surprising? I hear you have one of the things that Ronald Reagan was most proud of. This is one of his best piece of work of legislation, and yet you have another Republican president destroying it or tearing it up. Isn't that a little surprising? Have you ever seen in party lines where the White House destroys something that one of their leaders of their party put together?
Yes, the revered President Reagan. And it was a long process. The INF took many years, and finally with Margaret Thatcher from England and help from Helmut Schmidt from Germany, and Margaret Thatcher getting it together, and Reagan and Gorbachev. A lot of work went into this, and now it's so unfortunate not to at least make an effort to bring the Russians into compliance, work with the Chinese on bringing them into the agreement. That's where the effort should be made, in my view. American leadership exercising its power in the right way.
Well, that's it. Senator Chafee, both leaders are accusing the other country of violating the treaty. Has the U.S. or Russia actually violated the treaty, in your opinion, from what you can see?
Well, the INF has all these inspection components to the treaty. You're allowed to go in and see what's going on, and we just have to exercise those components of the treaty and make sure inspectors are in there. And before you start crying wolf and accusing people of violating it, let's ascertain whether that's true or not. And we can under the treaty. That's clearly part of the treaty.
Well, it's interesting because you bring that up, because this is all about transparency. I mean, that was one of the best parts this treaty did, was put inspectors in these sites, these nuclear sites. If we tear up this treaty, does that mean that we possibly could lose these inspectors and those eyes in those areas?
Well, I think everybody's worried about another arms race, and that's exactly what Gorbachev and Reagan wanted to avoid. Enough of these nuclear weapons. We live in a precious planet that just cannot afford to have the threat of nuclear holocaust on us. And cooler heads prevailed back then, but there seems to be more hot heads now, and that's regrettable.
Well, it's interesting because President Trump, he has been accused of this in the past with other deals. Do you think possibly he could be doing this just to beef up the U.S. nuclear arsenal, something he did finally mention on Monday, and eventually just make sure that his name is on it?
Well, I do think he has talked about China also, and they're not a signatory to the treaty, so maybe that's part of it, get the Chinese in. That's what we might hope, and certainly some of the rhetoric on North Korea worked in our favor in finally getting some of that bombastic rhetoric seemed to have worked, getting North Korea to the table. So maybe there's a glimmer of hope that this strategy might lead to a better outcome than what we can see in an arms race, another nuclear arms race.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up North Korea, because that's been the whole goal, is to denuclearize them. We didn't do it, though, by threatening that we were going to beef up our own nuclear potential. We did it just by actually using other forces instead of the ultimate threat, which is, I think, in the world of weaponry, a nuke. National Security Advisor John Bolton is meeting with Russian President Putin today. Does he kind of have his hands all over this? Because this is something he proposed a decade ago that he wanted to have done. This, is this something that maybe might be his kind of pushing?
Well, John Bolton was up for UN ambassador when I was in the Senate, and so I'm familiar with his background. And yes, I was not a John Bolton fan during those times when he was proposed to be a UN ambassador. I just thought he was too much of a hawk in this dangerous world we live in with nuclear weapons and American power. Culturally, economically, militarily, we should use that power to make more allies. And the Bolton approach seemed to be to insult all our friends around the world and take that unipolar, unilateral approach. Of course, the Iraq War is the biggest example of that, to complex problems. And let's see if he's changed, if the leopard has different spots from what I saw back in the Bush administration, George W. Bush administration of 2001 to 2006.
Absolutely. Well, that's the thing, when you're talking about budgets, since you were in the Senate, one of the easiest ways to pass a budget without people kind of questioning it, especially back in your districts, was to say we raised it to help the military. So in this case, when we're looking at a $716 billion budget, it's been going towards defense spending. Do you think this Russia, all the talk about Russia, is helping pass such a large defense spending bill?
We have no trouble passing that defense bill. That's unfortunate also. And the truth is that there's really no one second to us militarily. When I asked the question in the Senate, who is second to us, the general that was in charge of the other evaluating other countries said the UK. Now that's maybe 10 years ago when I was in the Senate, but we're so powerful militarily, nuclear submarines and bombers, and nobody is even close to us. We should be using that power that we have in a better, more responsible way to craft a more peaceful world, in my view. And yes, we do need a strong military, and when we spend that kind of money, that should give us the power to be willing to make mistakes. We have the power. We have so much power. Take a risk for peace rather than constantly saber rattling with some of our allies and friends around the world.
Well, Senator Chafee, thanks for joining us and sharing some of your firsthand experience and insight into what is going on today.
Hey YouTube, thanks for checking out our channel. We hope you enjoyed the video. We have tons of content for you just like this. For more of RT America's one-of-a-kind news and analysis, be sure to subscribe and never stop questioning more.